So dear audience, hello and warm welcome to our very festive event from my side. What we will be doing in the next 15 minutes, we will be still discussing the war in Ukraine, but now a very different aspect, because up till now we had very interesting, very fruitful and illuminating discussions on the economic effects of the war, on the geopolitical challenges, on the security issues, right? But one thing which was left aside is about people. Because migration, because the war essentially generates a huge flow of refugees from Ukraine to Europe. We know all it from the media. And this is the crisis which was unforeseen since the times of the World War II in terms of the scale, in terms of the speed with which people arrive, and in terms of the challenges which are posed currently to European labor markets. And just to give you a bit of a flavor, so up till now we have almost 6.8 million refugees which crossed the EU borders and arrived to Europe over the last 3 months. Obviously, the biggest flow was over March, but still the numbers are still staying very, very high. However, one thing should not be left aside is that at the same time, as people are coming to Europe, lots of Ukrainians are leaving the European Union, and with 6.8 million of people arriving, over 2.2 million people left. And in the first few weeks of war, those were mainly men who used to work in Europe and who now left back to Ukraine to fight. However, in the recent weeks, so since mid-April, mainly women, children, and elderly, so people who earlier left the country, they started to come back. So this is a very important observation when we look at the migration flow, because that really tells a lot about people, about their intention to stay, and about the ways with which Europe has to address the current refugee crisis. And we know that the crisis is of a huge scale, right? However, there are a number of crucial things which distinguish this refugee crisis from all the previous crises saw by Europe. And now I'm going to just give you an overall outlook of all the major reasons. And firstly, the people, right? Because people who are coming now from Ukraine in terms of their demographic profile, not only, but mainly in terms of demographic profile, they are very different from, say, refugee crisis of 2015, 2016, because these are mainly women. And according to some very recent fresh surveys conducted with the refugees across Europe, we know that over 80% of people are women. Average age is below 40. Only 20% came alone. And from remaining 80%, 60% arrived with at least one child. So from these estimates, very draft ones, we see already that this sample of refugees is very, very different from the previous waves. When we think about the crisis with the Syrian refugees, right, those were mainly young males. And now we have a completely opposite. We have young females with children. And obviously those people, they need a completely different approach, and they need to have a completely different steps to be taken in order to integrate them in the European labor market, right? Second major difference, it's not just about women, it's about educated women, because in Ukraine the average education level is higher than in Europe. I won't go into details talking about the education majors, about the differences in curriculum, courses, workload when it comes to universities. However, if we just say at this level of just talking about the educational degrees, we have much more females with upper secondary education and, importantly, with the university education in Ukraine. And many of those females, they are now heading or they have already arrived to Europe. However, at the same time, they lack labor market. Many of them lack labor market severely, because employment rate for females in all age groups, controlling for various demographic characteristics, is much lower than for the European females. And at the same time, an activity rate is much higher. So it obviously stems from various factors. It has a lot to do with the availability of the childcare in Ukraine. It has a lot to do with the tradition. It has a lot to do with various family background factors, culture. There are lots of the whole world of factors behind that. But the crucial number is that in Ukraine, females are highly educated, but they have less labor market commitment. They are less likely to be employed than European female. The third crucial difference is about the allocation of refugees across Europe. So those are the very recent numbers we see here on the map about the percentage of refugees, so a share of refugees registered under the temporary protection scheme as a share of the total population of the country. So it's not just a raw number, it's a share of the population in respective country. And we see that there is the major bunching of people is in the Central Eastern European countries plus Moldova. Moldova is not on the map, but it is currently the major destination country, and lots of the highest percent of people as a share of the native population is registered in Moldova. However, we see that Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, they received the highest percent of the refugees. And you see that this is principally different from the refugee crisis of the last years, because in 2015-16, people were mainly heading to Western European countries, right? Germany, France. In this case, the case with Ukrainians, they stay close to Ukrainian border, which is by itself a very important indicator. And I will mention that briefly in the next slides. So the fourth major difference is obviously about the European response to the crisis. And I'm quite sure that every single person in the audience heard about the welcoming, very positive attitude from the European Union and about the temporary protection scheme, which was launched to support Ukrainian refugees. And this is indeed a very important step, and it really serves as a strong basis for further integration of people in the labor market, because firstly, it assumes unlimited, immediate access to the labor market as soon as you get the residence, obviously. So it increases the chances to get employed. It also assumes a relatively easy movement across European countries, right? Because for the refugees, they're quite restrained in the country where they applied for the refugee status. As for Ukrainians, they get a temporary protection, so they get a residence card which allows them to stay in another European country for 90 days within 180 days window, as far as I know. And this is really important because it allows people to move across Europe and to look out for job opportunities. Maybe they find some better job abroad, and then they are free to move. The temporary protection scheme also lays a very important role on the public employment services, and therefore it is assumed to reduce. I wouldn't say that it completely eliminates, but it is assumed to reduce the risk of labor exploitation and being employed in the shadow economy. And at the same time, because the public employment services, they are also supposed to provide a personalized approach towards people, right? To help them find the training, to help them integrate in various courses, learn the language, importantly. It all together helps to increase the chances to find the job which corresponds to your qualification. And last but not least, the same temporary protection scheme is launched in all European countries with the same package of services, with the same package of rights for the refugees, and therefore it is assumed to even out the allocation of refugees, so basically to reduce the pressure for a single European country, which, as we see already with this very fresh data, is not necessarily the case, because anyways we see a clustering of people in Central Eastern European countries. And last but not least, the final factor which distinguishes current refugee flow from the previous refugee flows is an intention to stay. Because when we think about the refugees from 2015-2016, majority of them intended to stay long-term, if not permanently, in the European Union, right? For Ukrainians, this is not necessarily the case, and we already see it with the data, because this number, 2.2 million people who left the country. As I said, they're not only males coming back home to fight, there are also women, children, elderly, who arrived, say, at end of February, or they arrived in March, and now as the front line shifted, for instance, from Kyiv and Chernihiv, they can safely come back home, and lots of people are doing that. However, what is the crucial factors which are shaping the intention to stay for people? And the first thing is the family separation, because in Ukraine, the conscription age is from 18 to 60, and males in this age group, they cannot leave the country. That means that females, mothers, are traveling alone with the children, and essentially they will aim to come back as soon as it's safe enough. Secondly, accommodation. It really differs across European countries. The way the governments approach accommodation problem is very different. However, on average, it is fairly complicated to find accommodation, especially in the medium run. So for a short stay, couple of weeks, for a couple of months, you can do that, but in the long run it is very costly. It is largely complicated. So this will be one of the factors that people will tend to move back to Ukraine, because a very less than 5% of refugees all across Europe are staying currently in the refugee centers, right, in the reception centers. So they try to find private accommodation, which is very challenging. Thirdly, employment success. People can enter labor market right away. Obviously, they try to do that. If they cannot find a job easily, if they cannot find the job which can correspond to their competence or give them sufficient pay, they will tend to come back. And last but not least, the geographical proximity. So this is a mere technical reason, right? Because Ukraine is way geographically closer to Europe, and logistically it's much easier to come back to Ukraine from Germany or France or Austria than for a Syrian or Afghan person to come back to Syria or Afghanistan. So this is a mere technical thing, but it is important. Okay, so now, as we keep in mind those crucial differences across the earlier refugee flows and the inflow of Ukrainian refugees, we can now shape, or we can outline a couple of major opportunities and challenges which European labor markets and European governments face. So the main, first, on a positive note, opportunity. And the key opportunity for refugees arises from labor shortages. So we do know that European markets are very short on labor. The shortages differ across countries, they differ across sectors, right? However, on average, there is a shortage of labor. And Ukrainians can use it as a big opportunity to find employment. And the recent data shows that up until now, roughly 1/3 of refugees in Poland already found employment, some sort of employment, 1/6 in Czechia as well. So there are already some indications that people find some job, right? So at least temporary, at least short term, but they do. And this is obviously a positive indication. And this is an opportunity for European labor markets to take Ukrainian refugees, to recognize them, if necessary, to provide additional training, to provide language courses, but to help them integrate as soon as possible. However, before we even talk about employment, keeping in mind the core characteristic of refugees, those are young women with children, we first need to think about the childcare, because this is an essential step which has to be taken before we can integrate females on the labor market, right? Because we need to provide them with preferably full-time, accessible and affordable childcare, and also enrollment for older kids, enrollment in the local schools. And we also know that the childcare is not an easy topic, right? Especially in the big cities, childcare is generally quite restricted. So with refugees tending to stay in the big cities, the problem of childcare availability is magnified. And the second major issue I want to outline, and this is the same old issue we always talk about when we think about the refugees, generally migrants. How do they find job? Do they actually find the job which is sufficient, which corresponds sufficiently to their skills and education? So this is the problem of over-education and skill mismatch. And this is also the problem for Ukrainian refugees, right? Despite they have a full access to the labor market, they can find the job supposedly quickly and easily without less bureaucracy, shorter procedures. It's still likely that they will try to take any job offer at first, because they have to sustain themselves. Obviously, they have a right to take the social payments, but in most of the countries, they're too low to sustain the family, and obviously this is a short-term solution. They need to see a medium-term perspective at least. And the problem, which was the main factor which explains this complexity when it comes to looking for a job, is that Ukraine has a number of differences in terms of educational systems. So it could be difficult to recognize the degrees, could be bureaucratically complicated. Plus, even if you have your degree recognized, not necessarily your skills could be applicable in Austria, right? Because if you think about the lawyer or an engineer with same engineering or degree in law in Ukraine and in Austria, obviously the set of skills could be different, because for engineers the programs could be different. Programs used in Austria and programs used in Ukraine. For lawyers, obvious thing, the law is completely country-specific, so not necessarily the case. And last but not least, lack of work experience, especially for females. And this small graph here, this is the only evidence up to date on the skills education, education employment mismatch from Slovakia, which clearly shows us that over 20% of refugees who found employment in Slovakia over 20% have higher education. However, less than 4% found job which requires higher education. So that basically means that people are taking up the jobs, whatever is offered, even if it is way below their qualification. They do take the job because they have to sustain themselves. The question is how long this overeducation will continue. And for that one, we need obviously to have a little bit longer time perspective. Okay, so what are the major takeaways? 3 points. First one, childcare. And this is really a bold point because the childcare is an essential step. If there is no childcare for Ukrainian females coming with children, they will never ever be able to enter labor market, firstly. Secondly, recognition of education degrees. And this is really a big debate because obviously the procedure has to be easy, has to be unbureaucratic, relatively fast, and it has to be unified across the European Union, right? And this is certainly something which requires policy attention because the sooner one can recognize the educational credentials, the sooner one can try find a job according to this qualification and not just taking whatever job in whatever industry offered. And last but not least, well, we need to identify intentions to stay because as we see with the current numbers, people are moving to Europe and back. So people are coming back home. Some people intend to stay a couple of weeks. Some people intend to stay forever. And therefore, when we talk about the integration perspectives and the steps which have to be taken to integrate people on the labor market, one has to identify what is the intention to stay. Because if it's a short-term intention, then obviously one has to invest a lot in just ensuring that the person has enough income for this period and a decent accommodation. But if it is about the permanent stay, then one has to really think about, well, how can we make the person apply skills, competences, and education to the full extent, but not just stay on the low-level job for his or her entire life. So those were the major takeaways, and I would stop at this point, and thanks for your attention. And yeah, if we have time, we would take the questions.